Hey, 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 somebody throw some confetti and blow into a noisemaker or something because we're ready to move on from chapter 2 to chapter 3 of First Peter. And if I know you're probably wondering if we were ever going to get there, and the answer is it just takes a while. But as difficult as the part of chapter 2 was, it talked about submitting to every human authority. Now we're going into the deeper waters. Listen to this, verse 1 of chapter 3. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husband, so that if any of them do not believe in the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. That's a pretty tough way to lead out, isn't it? Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. There's a little 2 words or 3 words, in the same way, I guess that's 4 words, that precedes that submit thing. In the same way. Well, what are we talking about? In the same way as what? Well, think about all that's gone before. Where most the most direct antecedent to that goes back to what we just finished talking about, that you're like sheep going astray, and before that where it said Jesus left an example to follow in his steps. That the point I get from this, the what are we talking about in the same way as what, I think has to do with reflecting God's relationship with Christ's submission to God's will. And when you look at this whole thing in the last chapter, as Peter reflects back on the passion narrative of the unjust, unfair, horrible sufferings of Christ, and yet Christ never returned a threat for violence. He never returned violence for violence. What Peter said is he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Okay, in the same way, I think that may be the key. In the same way, entrusting yourself to him who judges justly. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. There's a few things in that worth looking at. The first thing is the idea of submit. Now, we talked about the idea of submitting back when we talked about submit to every human authority. The idea of submitting is to voluntarily align oneself under the authority of another. A very huge thing in the marriage relationship is that there is a God-ordained structure. This does not have to do with value of people. It is not about who is most valuable in a family. That's not what the structure is, not about the value of those within the structure. It's about organizing a family so that it can be healthy and whole, so that it can withstand whatever the world brings to it. For a wife to voluntarily align herself under the authority of her husband is a harsh thing in the 21st century. And it was in the last century as well. I hate this, but for hundreds of years, misogynistic men who wanted to keep women under their thumb, who wanted to control women, who wanted women to never count, used this verse and a couple of others similar to it to drive home what they said was the truth, that the women need to keep it where it belongs, in the kitchen. They need to stay barefoot and pregnant. Their whole thing is to take care of the master of the house, the man, the husband. This is very unfortunate and is very unlike what Jesus taught and how he modeled his value for both women and men. I'm not going to go into it deeply because it would take you already know if I go into anything at any depth, it's going to take me a long time to come all the way around Robin Hood's barn with it. But I will say, in a healthy relationship, for a wife to submit to her husband should not be over difficult. When I was in my university experience getting a master's degree in human relations, we were asked, or part of our assignment was to write a paper and then present it to the class on what we thought was the most pressing human relations issue. This was in the 90s. For me, the most pressing human relations issue that I saw was the degradation of the family. What I thought was the dismantling, and I still think it continues today, and now voices are returning, loud voices, that the family needs to be dismantled, that marriage needs to be done away with. I know why that smells like smoke, because it's straight from the pit of hell. And I'm not talking about the people who are saying it. I think they are misguided. They are not the enemy. They're victims of the enemy. But Satan has all along wanted to not just do harm, but to destroy the family, to destroy at least the design God had for a healthy, whole family. Well, I picked that topic and I wrote what I thought was a pretty good paper, and I did my best to leave theology out of it. And although I did speak about my personal values, and I even used, this is a term from back in the 90s, traditional family values. Well, everything went pretty well until when you finished presenting your paper, then the class had a chance to ask questions. The cohort that I was with in my master's program was made up 75% of women, and more than half of those women had been divorced, most of them recently. So when I talk about traditional family values, I am punching a hot button with the majority of the folks in that room. And I don't blame them for having some pretty pointed questions. One of the questions obviously was, when you say traditional family values, what do you specifically mean? Well, and then I had to say, for me, my view of traditional family values goes back to what I believe is the source for all of my values, and that is the Christian Bible. I mean, I was probably sweating bullets, and I felt like I needed to do a little tap dance at the front of the room, because these women were not just casual with their questions. It was clear they had a very different perspective. And one of the women said, so you mean that idea that women are there just to serve the man and the man gets everything? He said, well, no, I don't feel that. I do know, I think what you're talking about is an idea from the New Testament where it is said that women are to submit to their husbands. And that's as far as I got. And boy, that was like, holy smokes. I just hit the bullseye for ringing the bell, and they were ready to come out after me. And then I said, well, here's, don't leave out the rest of the idea in that particular passage, which is, wives, submit to your husbands. And then Paul writes, as unto the Lord. And then he writes another sentence or two, and then right after that he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So I kind of tap danced through that, as I say, and then my question was, would it be hard to submit to a man who you were totally convinced would love you so much that your interest would always be ahead of his interest, that he would give himself up for you. And he followed the example of Jesus, who went all the way to death, humiliating death on a cross for the benefit of the other. Would it be hard to submit to that kind of man? And the woman who had voiced the question said, well, of course not, but they don't exist. It was a wake-up call for me, because, in her world, they don't exist. And part of the reason they don't exist is because, well, number one, she's not attracting that kind of guy. And number two, she's right. To a large degree, they're just not out there, because we've raised a generation of men that are only interested in being happy. And whatever the cost, that's no problem, because the objective is I will be happy. And if you can't make me happy, I'll find somebody who does. Or I'll just go on my own and seek my own happiness. Now, it's not only men that are that way. I am dealing often in my counseling with women who have this same distorted lens through which they look at life. Peter is saying, for the Christian wife, in following the example of Jesus, who entrusted himself to the one who judges justly and endured much more than any of us, I think it's safe to say anyone in my world will ever have to endure. In that way, wives, submit to your husbands. Willingly align yourself under the authority of your husband. Indirectly, this makes me say to husbands, why don't you make a strong effort to be worthy of that kind of respect? Well, why? Why submit yourselves? So that if any of them do not believe the word, and that when he writes about the word, he's talking about the gospel, the message. If any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. This is an interesting play on words. They don't believe the word. Let's convert them without words. I think I shared this before, that's been attributed to St. Francis Assisi, and I don't know whether it was him or not, but I kind of like the message of the saying, which is, preach the gospel always. If necessary, use words. Now, I'm going to tell you, in my life's experience, it has been necessary to use words. But the most poignant, the most powerful way for me to preach the gospel is through my life and how I deal with and treat other people. And not just this anonymous, faceless other people. I'm talking about the person just across from me. When a wife can love God and her husband and entrust herself to the one who judges justly, submitting to the authority of her husband, by her life's example, she can, I know examples of this, she can win over an unbelieving husband without words. That's a huge challenge. I as a man, I will admit to any woman who takes exception with me or pushes it back, I don't blame you. I would push back too. I have 3 daughters, massively intelligent, incredibly gifted and talented, who have had to figure out how do they submit to the authorities in their lives and not be untrue to what God has built into them and gifted them with. I get that. They're all 3 married, and they are having to navigate this dynamic of the organizational structure of a family. I'm going to come back to that because there's a little bit more to say, and I promise I'm not going to take another 2.5 hours to go through it all. I just want to try and touch on some salient aspects of the idea that God designed this order for a family for a reason. It's not random, and it's not punitive. Well, my time's already up, so I'm going to have to close. I'd love to meet you here next time, and I'd love it if you'd maybe invite a friend to join us for Soul Care with Stevie Boy.